In order to continue financing the war against Ukraine, the Kremlin will raise taxes for people and businesses. This was reported by the Center for Countering Disinformation. Moscow is focused solely on military spending at the expense of social programs, so the tax increase will affect everyone. And although the Kremlin leadership insists that military objectives will soon be achieved, in reality the Russian army has not made significant gains on the battlefield and is rapidly losing personnel. More details can be found in the report by my colleagues.
The Russian army is advancing in the Zaporizhia direction and is also continuing massive strikes, allegedly targeting Ukraine's military facilities. This was stated during his report to Putin on October 7th by the chief of the General Staff of the Russian Federation, Gerasimov. In response, the head of the Kremlin said that the decisions made in February 2022 to launch Russia's full-scale war against Ukraine were correct and timely, and that the goals of the so-called special military operation would be achieved. However, experts note that these statements have nothing to do with reality.
For the aggressor, probably one of the key problems is that there are no significant changes on the front line. The fact is that the so-called special military operation is at a dead end. The economic situation in Russia has become significantly more complicated, to put it mildly. I mean, including the oil refining system, the growing dependence on Chinese resources, and so on and so forth.
Stagnation or already a recession. Even according to the most optimistic forecasts by economists, Russia's economic growth rate in 2025 will not exceed 1%. In 8 months, the Russian budget deficit has already reached almost 2% of the annual GDP, and by the end of the year it will rise to 2.6%. So where does Putin plan to get the money to continue the war? From the pockets of citizens? A new wave of tax increases is being launched in Russia. Thus, in 2026, the authorities plan to collect almost 2.5 trillion rubles more from the population and businesses. The main source of revenue is raising the VAT rate from 20 to 22%, which will lead to higher prices.
This indicates that Russia is running out of resources to finance its war of aggression against Ukraine. That's why the regime is trying to shift this burden onto citizens and businesses. Next year, the army and security forces will consume about 40% of the budget. Since the war remains a priority for the Kremlin, these expenditures stay at a high level. At the same time, social programs are being cut, and the tax burden on the population is increasing. The Center for Countering Disinformation under the National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine on Telegram.
Putin's goal is to wage war against Ukraine at any cost. It doesn't matter if he has to completely rob his own people or send thousands of Russians to certain death at the front.
We state that Russian troops have been ordered to storm our positions at any cost. Accordingly, the level of Russian losses has increased significantly. Just our SBU fighters alone, and only in the Pokrovsk direction, are now eliminating more than 100 Russian occupiers per day. And that's not counting the results of the actions of fighters from other components of our defense and security forces. In total, over the past month, the fighters of the SBU Special Operations Center A have eliminated 3,028 Russian occupiers. Each of these has been properly verified. Volodymyr Zelensky, President of Ukraine, on Telegram.
Russian propaganda will now pay special attention to shaping the proper military political mindset among the personnel. Russian soldiers, both conscripts and contract servicemen, will be told about so-called heroic deeds of participants in the war against Ukraine. In addition, Russian servicemen will be forced to study Putin's annual address to the Federal Assembly, according to the publication Verstka.
According to the plan, 10 hours are allocated for lectures about these heroic deeds. These lectures will be given every month throughout the year. In addition, soldiers will have to attend the traditional lecture, Extremism, Terrorism, and Neo-Nazism as a security threat, to which Russophobia has also been added for next year, according to the publication Verstka.
Putin's desire to militarize Russia as much as possible could turn into a disaster for him. The Kremlin fears that the return of tens of thousands of soldiers and former convicts from the front will trigger a surge in crime and social destabilization. The situation is already being compared to the 1990s, when former participants of the Afghan war formed gangs and mafia groups, according to the Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service. Since 2023, military courts have received nearly 1,000 cases under articles related to murder and intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm resulting in death. And the number of convictions for such crimes has risen sharply. If in 2022 there were 38 such cases, then in the current period of 2025, Russian courts have considered 377 new cases. Yulia Granovskaya for Freedom TV channel.
During a meeting with Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev, Russian dictator Putin essentially admitted that the Azal passenger plane was shot down by Russian air defense missiles, but ultimately blamed Ukraine. He claimed that on the day of the tragedy, Russia was allegedly tracking 3 Ukrainian drones that had crossed the border of the Russian Federation. Let me remind you, the Azerbaijani Airlines passenger plane crashed in Kazakhstan on December 25, 2024. It was on a flight from Baku to Grozny but was denied landing, allegedly due to air defense operations. The pilots of the heavily damaged airliner decided to fly over the Caspian Sea to Kazakhstan, but were unable to land the plane, crashing during their 3rd attempt to land. There were 67 people on board, including crew members. As a result of the crash, 38 people died. Sanctions in action. Russian airlines are preparing for the loss of hundreds of civilian airplanes and helicopters. This was stated by the Federal Air Transport Agency. If 2 years ago there were more than 2,000 aircraft in the country, now only half as many are still flying. Import substitution in aviation has also failed. The Sukhoi Superjet 100 airliner still depends on foreign components, and the project for its full localization keeps getting postponed. Larissa Petruk will provide the details.
Sanctions and international isolation are grounding Russian civil aviation. In the coming years, companies may lose hundreds of foreign aircraft. Due to problems with repairs and the inability to purchase original parts, 58 aircraft have gone out of service recently. And this is just the beginning, they admit at Rostec. At least 200 of the remaining Western airliners with carriers which have been cut off from repairs and spare parts due to sanctions will have to be taken out of service by 2030 and replaced with domestic ones. According to the head of Rostec, nearly 30% of the Western civil airliner fleet is at risk of being grounded in the next 5 years. This fleet consists of about 700 Boeing and Airbus aircraft, which account for 90% of passenger air transportation in Russia, writes the Moscow Times on Telegram. Replacing these aircraft with domestic ones is no less of a challenge. The service life of Soviet-era planes is coming to an end. It is becoming increasingly difficult to create new fleets due to disrupted supply chains for components, and the high central bank interest rate is holding back investment, writes Reuters. Thus, as of August since the beginning of 2025, Russian aircraft manufacturers have delivered only 1 out of 15 planned commercial aircraft.
Mainly aircraft will be withdrawn from this fleet. These are old Soviet aircraft, planes built back in Soviet times, such as the An-24, An-26, Yak-40. The problem is not that they are being withdrawn. That's actually a good thing, because old planes that have reached the end of their service life, hopefully they won't extend it any further, will finally be retired, and that stewardess will finally be laid to rest. But what will replace them? So the plan was that we would quickly organize everything in 3 days, and then everyone would want to be friends with us again, and somehow everything would work itself out. Because purchases were being made, but now, to be honest, there's nothing to replace them with.
The agency's publication reports that the number of fatalities in commercial aviation crashes in Russia since the beginning of 2025 has exceeded the total number of victims from such incidents over the previous 2 years combined. According to statistics from Rostransnadzor, in just part of 2025, 53 people have already died in 4 crashes. For comparison, in 2024 there were 17 aviation incidents, with 37 fatalities. In response to the growing risks, the Federation's aviation authorities have planned inspections of regional air carriers. During these inspections, officials are to determine the level of flight safety, the maintenance of aircraft airworthiness, and the training of specialists. The reason for these inspections was the crash of an Angara Airlines An-24 in July and the risk of a similar disaster happening again. According to Rostransnadzor, the number of aviation incidents in 2024 rose to 17, compared to 8 in 2023, and the number of fatalities increased to 37 from 12, reports the Moscow Times. The Ukrainian Foreign Intelligence Service reports that Russian airlines are increasingly resorting to cannibalization, transferring working parts from one aircraft to another in order to somehow maintain their fleets. For example, the companies Volga, Dnipro and Aeroflot recently reached an agreement to transfer the last 8 Boeing aircraft. These aircraft will serve as donors for spare parts. At the beginning of 2022, Russia had approximately 1,500 to 1,800 Western-made civilian aircraft in operation. Today, that number has decreased several times over. The contract between the airlines Volga, Dnipro and Aeroflot is the first case in the Russian aviation market where a passenger airline acquires cargo aircraft solely for the purpose of dismantling them for parts. In the medium term, this will lead to a reduction in the aircraft fleet, an increase in transportation costs, and further degradation of Russian civil aviation. If the current conditions persist, by 2026 Russia's aircraft fleet could be reduced by more than half. From a statement on the website of the Foreign Intelligence Service of Ukraine. Let me remind you, about a year ago, Putin said that Russia needed to build its own airplanes and publicly gave corresponding instructions to state companies. He was referring to the passenger version of the light multipurpose Baikal aircraft. However, not a single aircraft has been put into operation so far. Larissa Petruk for Freedom TV channel.